Hey everyone, Laurie Spencer here. Welcome back to the dark side of RFK Jr. We are almost finished. We're at the epilogue of Jerry Oppenheimer's book, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream. We made it. We finally made it to the end of this book. And boy, what a ride it's been. I hope you've enjoyed this book club reading. I hope that you'll send me some questions and comments and let me know your thoughts on the book. If you've made it this far in the journey, thank you for sticking with it. And I'll have more interesting books on the Kennedys in the weeks to come on this channel. So if you're interested in the Kennedys, please do subscribe to my other YouTube channel, which is at Kennedy Americans. You can also find me on Rumble at Kennedy Americans. And be sure to click the notifications bell. You'll always be notified when new chapters are coming. And I think when I finish this RFK Jr. book, I'm going to go back to the Kennedys After Camelot by J. Randy Taraborelli. That's the book that I was reading, and I got a few chapters into it, and then I kind of got into this RFK Jr. book and decided to do this one because he's so newsworthy at the moment with the appointment as HHS Secretary. I felt that this one should take precedence. But now that we're done with this, I think I'll go back to that incredible book called The Kennedys After Camelot. And if you'd like to check out the first couple of chapters of that book, you can find them in the playlists tab of my channel. Just look for The Kennedys After Camelot. So, if you're reading along with me in the hardcover edition of Oppenheimer's book, we are reading the epilogue today on page 351. Of RFK and Ethel Kennedy's 11 children, Robert Francis Kennedy Jr. did not turn out to be the best or the worst, but rather the most complex, the most controversial, and the most enigmatic. His older sister, Kathleen, and his older brother, Joe, had followed their assassinated father into politics. The baby of the family, Rory, had become a respected documentary filmmaker. At the other extreme, their brother Michael, accused of having a sexual relationship with a teenage babysitter, had escaped prosecution and probable incarceration, but was killed a year later in a bizarre ski accident. Their young brother David, long addicted to drugs, died of a lethal overdose in 1984. In that star-crossed, dysfunctional branch of the Kennedy clan alone, there was a succession of broken marriages, of abuse and alcohol and other substances. Of all his siblings, and even many of his Kennedy and Skakel relatives, Bobby infamously held the record for the most marriages, 3, and probably the longest addiction problem. Some people close to him wondered how he was able to survive at all, let alone make an esteemed professional life for himself. That was underscored by Bobby himself at the funeral for his closest friend, Peter Kaplan, who died of cancer in November 2013 at the age of 59. At Kaplan's funeral service, Bobby was heard to say, quote, "This wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to be giving my eulogy." As a friend of both men observed later, everyone expected Bobby to die first. Closing in on the 7th decade of his life, having overcome years of drug use, beginning when he was just 14, having been expelled from 2 boarding schools, having been arrested for possession of drugs at least twice, having faced a near-fatal heroin overdose, having had 2 failed marriages, and having fathered 6 children, having suffered the suicide of his estranged second wife, and having ignited scandal because of his drugs and womanizing, Bobby's successful life as the nation's most prominent environmental activist and lawyer was still miraculously on track in the 2nd decade of the 21st century. His plan going forward was to focus on the important issue of climate change. He'd already sparked controversy on this hot-button topic by suggesting that those who were skeptics about global warming, mainly those naysayers who didn't agree with him, should be thrown in jail. Bobby denied having put it that way. Still, his timing was on the mark. As it happened, scientists determined that 2014 had been the hottest year on Earth since record-keeping began in 1880. Nevertheless, with all he had done in the environmental field and planned to do, he personally faced great disappointment, that he never actually realized the expectations for him as the family's bearer of the torch. If Bobby ever had a blueprint for a political future, it was never fulfilled, or so Jerry Oppenheimer wrote 10 years ago in 2015. Of course, now we see that at least some of that political future Bobby dreamed of was partially fulfilled in 2024 when he ran for president, and then, of course, abandoned his campaign to endorse Donald Trump in exchange for this position in Trump's administration as HHS secretary. As a close associate of more than 3 decades noted, quote, he would have very much liked to have followed in his father's footsteps and been a senator and a public servant. He would have liked to have held political office. He would have liked to debate, and that's one of the things he's good at. But he reconciled himself to that not happening, and Bobby's been very disappointed that it never happened. From the moment he was born, he was deemed destined for political greatness. After all, he possessed his idolized father's name. He was a Kennedy, with all the power and privilege that came with it. There was nothing that could go wrong, nothing that could keep him from reaching the pinnacle. That possibility had been drummed into him by his surrogate father, Lem Billings, the homosexual Kennedy clan acolyte who took control of Bobby's life after his father was murdered. It was Billings who convinced Bobby, beginning when he was an undergrad at Harvard, that one day he could be president, and Bobby began to believe that that was his destiny. But so much did go wrong. Later in life, he refused to blame the trauma of his father's assassination or his Kennedy and Skakel genes for his addictive personality. Rather, he blamed the era in which he had grown up, the turbulent 60s. However, not everyone who knew Bobby well agreed with his assessment, particularly in regard to the issues of addiction and genes. As Robert Boyle, the respected environmentalist who had taken Bobby into the Riverkeeper organization after his heroin possession arrest, asserted in early 2015 to this author, Jerry Oppenheimer, quote, he's picked up every flaw that any Kennedy ever had from his grandfather onward and concentrated them, whether it's drugs or sex. All of the negative is just drained into him genetically. Just imagine his wife hanging herself. If his wife had emotional troubles, you look after her. You don't shake her off and screw 50 other women or whatever he put in his diary. Quite frankly, I don't think he has a conscience, which means he can never reflect on something that he thought he did wrong. He externalizes all of this, and that's his approach to life. Once, when asked by the New York Times why he hadn't gone into politics, Bobby arrogantly boasted, quote, I have enough friends and family who are in the House and Senate, so if I want legislation, I have the access. Still, Bobby had quietly looked into running in 2000 for the vacated seat of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Bobby was considered an obvious choice for a run. He possessed the historical context. His father had set up residency in New York, was termed a carpetbagger, but won the senatorial election in 1966. Oh, I have to correct that. The author made a mistake. It was 1964, not 1966, setting the stage for his fatal presidential campaign. Knowing he could be the chosen one, Bobby had met with a couple of savvy New York politicos to get their take on what he should do, and he came away deciding to stay out of the race. His conversations, he said, had been with the newly elected Senator Charles Schumer and the city's public advocate, Mark Green, both of whom, Bobby claimed, had advised him that the job would take up too much of his time and keep him away from his growing family. At the time, Mary Kennedy had had their 4th child, a son, Aiden, who was turning a year old. Bobby now had a brood of 6, including RFK III and Kick with his first wife, Emily. Claiming the demands of the office would keep him from seeing Aiden until he was 4.5, clearly an exaggeration, he denied that his decision had anything to do with the obvious, the many skeletons, known and unknown, in his dark past. Indeed, Bobby had much to hide and good reason to fear entering the political arena. And I will pause and add, just to update this, since this book was published 10 years ago, when Bobby announced his run for president in April of 2023 at his very first speech there in Boston, he tried to get ahead of these scandals because he knew the press was going to dig them up and report them. And he said, and echoed this several times through the campaign, quote, "I have so many skeletons in my closet that if they could all vote, I'd be king of the world." But when he was asked about his past drug problems by reporters covering a possible Senate run, he said he didn't think it would be an issue. Quote, "I have thick skin," he declared, and boasted, "If I wanted to run for something, there's always something to run for." In fact, Bobby had quietly decided in the late 1990s to remain in the environmental field. He had earned a national reputation for helping to build the Waterkeeper Alliance into an international organization. He had successfully sued major polluters. He was credited with cleaning up the Hudson River and making New York City's drinking water safe. And he was known for using radical tactics to accomplish his goals, such as when he was involved in creating a controversial public service message regarding clean drinking water in New York City reservoirs. In it, he bizarrely wondered how much of the Long Island Lolita, Amy Fisher's urine, was flowing into a New York City reservoir from the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility where she was confined for shooting her lover's wife. The ad, considered just too weird, never ran. Bobby was considered by friend and foe alike to be, quote, relentless, not easily put off, provocative, but not a consensus builder. There had been media talk in 2004 that if John Kerry had won the presidency, which he lost to George W. Bush, the post of the head of the Environmental Protection Agency would have gone to Bobby. The two had even discussed it, but of course nothing came of it. Then, in 2007, there was chatter that Bobby might run for Attorney General of New York State, but that never happened either. Some of the liberals who supported him politically because of his family name and the Kennedy brand of politics were taken aback when he was quoted as saying, "I wouldn't be a reliably liberal senator. My father was never a liberal. He was a devout Catholic with an open mind. I'm not trying to pretend I'm not who I am. I understand the gift I've been given, being in this family." Bobby would even pen an admiring afterword for a 2007 reprint of Conscience of a Conservative, Barry Goldwater's ghost-written 1964 screed that was must-reading for right-leaning conservative Republicans. And Bobby told New York Magazine in 2007 that he was, quote, more conservative in the traditional sense than George Bush, whom he despised, as evidenced by Bobby's third book, Crimes Against Nature, how George W. Bush and his corporate pals are plundering the country and hijacking our democracy. And I will add, I'll just pause here and add, since this needs an update 10 years later, just watch what happened during his presidential campaign of 2024. He started out running as a Democrat, of course, couldn't seem to get ahead in the Democratic. Well, there really weren't primaries to speak of because Joe Biden was the presumptive nominee. So in October of 2023, Kennedy left the Democratic Party and declared that he was now running as an independent. And as the campaign went along, it seemed like he was moving further and further to the right. And then in August of 2024, of course, he suspended his presidential campaign and endorsed President Donald Trump. So now he's the first Kennedy, probably the only Kennedy ever to serve in a Republican administration. Shocker to all. Back to the book. When Bobby sat for that 2000 interview with Oprah, she, like so many others in the past, pointedly asked him, "Why haven't you run for office?" Once again, he said it was because of his family, but with a caveat this time. Quote, "I've got 6 reasons running around this house," he said. In fact, when he gave that answer, 2 of those 6 were already adults. RFK III was 23 years old and living his own life, as was his 19-year-old daughter Kik, who was in college in California. Neither was running around the house, as he claimed. But Bobby continued, teasingly, quote, "I would run if there were an office open because I'm so distressed about the kind of country my children will inherit. I've tried to cling to the idea that I could be of public service without compromising my family life. But at this point, I would run." "For what?" Oprah asked. "For the Senate or for the New York governor's office," he said. But the problem was, he quickly added, quote, "My friends are in those offices, and I'm not going to run against them." Asked why he hadn't run for the Attorney General's job in New York, he once again used family as the excuse. Quote, "I have the kind of life where I can take my kids on trips with me. I can involve them in my work. I've always avoided politics because I didn't want to make commitments that would take me away from raising these children. But now America has changed so dramatically that I'm asking myself, what's going to be left of this country? I'm spending time with my kids, but maybe my time would be spent just as well if I tried to save the country." Oprah asked if he would ever run for the presidency, but he avoided giving her a direct response. He said, quote, "I really just try to live my life one day at a time and do what I'm supposed to do on that day. But if opportunities came up for me to run for office, I would probably do it. If that doesn't happen, then I'll happily continue doing what I'm doing. If Hillary Clinton left the Senate, I might run for that seat." When in 2008 that possibility arose after President Obama chose Hillary Rodham Clinton to be Secretary of State, Bobby said he conferred with his Uncle Ted, the senator who Bobby claimed at the time always advises me to spend time with my family. He always tells me that it often seems like things won't open up, but yet they do. I hope one day that I'll be able to do public service and government. It might happen one day. However, in an article about Bobby in the New York Times, in which his drug issues were mentioned, Ted Kennedy indicated that he had second thoughts about his nephew going into politics. Ted Kennedy said, quote, "I think, in a very dramatic way, Bobby is surviving, and his determination to get to a state of mind where he can be constructive has been central to him. He has faced some enormous challenges, some enormously serious challenges," unquote. In Ted Kennedy's 532-page memoir, True Compass, published posthumously in 2009, he wondered, like a lot of people, whether his nephew, JFK Jr., Bobby's cousin, would have ever sought public office had he not died so young. "I think he might have, and that he would have excelled," Ted Kennedy wrote. Many other young Kennedys were mentioned in the senator's book, including a few of Bobby's siblings, such as Michael and Rory and Max. But curiously, not a single word about Bobby was found. When Barack Obama was elected president, the Washington Post and Politico ran stories saying that Bobby was among those being considered to head the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or perhaps be named Secretary of the Interior. Quote, "Bobby Kennedy would be a shrewd early move for the new presidential team," Politico asserted. Obama advisors said the nomination for the EPA post would please both Hillary Clinton and Ted Kennedy. It would also raise the profile of the EPA, which would help to endear Obama to liberals. Kennedy has long championed a cleaner water supply for New York City. But there were a number of environmentalists who were adamantly against Bobby's nomination if it occurred. One reason was his opposition to installing wind turbines in Nantucket Sound to make cheap electricity. Even the New York Times had editorialized that, quote, "the project should be approved." The authors of a 2007 book entitled Cape Wind, Money, Celebrity, Class, Politics, and the Battle for Our Energy Future on Nantucket Island claimed that Senator Ted Kennedy had fought against the clean energy project because, quote, "that's where I sail." And one of the authors, Robert Whitcomb, called Bobby's reaction to the project, quote, "so irrational and incoherent, there's not much to say. He's a troubled person, he told the New York Daily News. Bobby claimed he got involved to help local fishermen who were against the project. We're not against the wind farm, he asserted. We just think that there are better places for it. He even wrote an op-ed piece for the Times headlined, "An Ill Wind Off Cape Cod." After the Washington Post mentioned Bobby as a potential EPA head, a Sierra Club member observed, quote, "My concern regarding RFK Jr. would be that, while he has a lot of passion about environmental protection, he is more of a show horse than a workhorse. The WP should have done their homework before throwing his name out there. Kennedy has never been able to actually get hired by anyone since his heroin conviction. Even California Governor Schwarzenegger was unable to get him a job in his administration." Bobby's one-time riverkeeper mentor and colleague, Robert Boyle, was also an opponent. As he said in early 2015 to this author, Jerry Oppenheimer, quote, "I would have testified in front of Congress and said this man is absolutely unfit to hold any office." And boy, we heard a lot of testimony like that at Bobby's recent confirmation hearings before the Senate for HHS Secretary, and in fact, even coming from his own cousin, Caroline Kennedy. The other objection to Bobby's selection for a powerful post in the Obama administration was his claim that there was a link between autism and childhood vaccines. Writing for Slate in August of 2005, the investigative journalist and author Arthur Allen, a vaccine proponent, noted that Bobby had been making the rounds of popular TV and radio programs such as The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and Don Imus in the morning, accusing government vaccine scientists of covering up a link between thimerosal, a preservative used in vaccines, and a massive increase in childhood autism in America. The other celebrity spokesperson for the same cause was the one-time Playboy playmate Jenny McCarthy. Allen also pointed out that in a July 2005 Rolling Stone article championing his thimerosal theory, Bobby had made, quote, "large and small errors and distortions." In 2014, an article about Bobby and the vaccine controversy in the Washington Post's Sunday magazine, written by the former Audubon magazine editor Keith Clore, noted that at first, for his Rolling Stone piece, Bobby was fated like a prize-winning muckraker. Then came the backlash. Critics charged that Kennedy was quoting material out of context. Rolling Stone had to make corrections. Enough doubts were raised that Salon, which also ran the piece, eventually retracted the story. Unbowed, Kennedy stands by the piece and admits to only a few inconsequential errors. After the Post story ran, Slate's science editor wrote that she thought the story had portrayed Bobby as, quote, "too passionate and too sympathetic." The Slate headline included the line, "He's actually obsessive and dangerous." The Slate piece sparked commenters to denounce Bobby. One called him, quote, "too partisan and kind of a nut when it comes to policy," and added, "throw in Kennedy's 1983 heroin bust and you've got yourself an uncomfortable nominee." Another critic called Bobby, quote, "an anti-vaccinationist crank, an activist extraordinaire, a booster of pseudoscience, a hothead prone to comparing political enemies to Hitler and Mussolini, and a lawyer whose science background appears to be primarily torturing science to fit his agenda more than anything else." In other words, there were many more against Bobby being nominated than for him getting a top administration post. Obama must have agreed because in December 2008, he chose a New Jersey official to head the EPA, Lisa Jackson, who had served as the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, the first African-American woman to head the EPA. 2 days after Christmas 2012, she stepped down, with critics claiming that Obama was failing in his commitment to climate change and other environmental issues. Bobby had been taking other questionable stands. One had to do with the assassination of his uncle, the president, which had occurred when Bobby was 9. On the evening of Friday, January 11th, 2013, Bobby and his sister Rory appeared together to discuss the Kennedys with Charlie Rose at the AT&T Performing Arts Center in, of all places, Dallas, infamously the scene of JFK's murder 50 years earlier. The event was advertised as a once-in-a-lifetime interview. The Dallas Morning News reported favorably on the appearance, with David Flick writing that Bobby entertained the audience with stories about growing up in the most famous family in America. But, according to Betsy Lewis, an arts writer for the Dallas Observer, quote, "It was a bizarre performance by a bizarre and charming Bobby, who Lewis noted, quote, avoided answering questions about his family. She described him as animated. He leaned into the round oak table with his chin in his hand, covering his mouth. It was like he had an automatic on-off switch." Instead of the folksy Kennedy stories Charlie Rose and the sold-out audience expected to hear, Bobby went on and on about how his father had conducted his own investigation into his brother's murder. Bobby, Lewis observed, quote, was losing the audience, and so he burst out, "My father believed that the Warren report was a shoddy piece of craftsmanship." The controversial Warren Commission report had concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin and had ruled out a conspiracy. In his talk, Bobby also claimed that America was, quote, becoming a national security state, that corporations want profits, and we'd be nuts to let them run the government, and, quote, nationalism in Africa, the end of colonialism, among other rants. At this point, Lewis noted, "I don't think anyone knew what the hell he was talking about. It was something about the Kennedy family airlifting President Obama's father out of Kenya to begin a new life in America." When the clearly exasperated Charlie Rose, noted for his calm questioning of famous figures on PBS, tried to get the interview back on track, he asked Bobby, "Why haven't you run for office?" Bobby's response, "I have 6 kids." According to Betsy Lewis, he should have answered, "My 1983 arrest for heroin possession." A political consultant with long-standing close ties to Bobby observed in early 2015, quote, "It's partially accurate that his use of drugs, his marriages, and his womanizing would come up in a political campaign by the media and by the opposition. But his use of heroin would never be an issue. It wouldn't keep him out of any race at any time because it happened when he was young, in the 60s. We looked at his drug use and we talked about it and determined that it was actually a plus because Bobby could say, 'I've gotten myself up and this is what I've done since then.' There were a lot of issues that went into Bobby's decision never to run for office. They were financial, personal, and opportunistic, and he was never going to bare his soul publicly about any of it. But there are things that were taken into consideration in making the decisions he chose about the direction of his life." Continued the source, who was a confidant of Bobby's for decades, quote, "He's a very complex guy who has had very difficult things thrown at him throughout his life. He's attracted all kinds of people to him. People picked at him all his life. People have wanted to be around him. People have asked things of him, have taken advantage of him, or tried to give him things like drugs and sex, and that he had essentially from birth because of his name. People think he's a Kennedy who can do whatever he wants, but he can't. He's circumscribed by that name too. Being a Kennedy isn't a be-all and end-all. It's also a cudgel people use against you. Bobby's handled it extraordinarily well, given all the shit that's been thrown at him. He's come out the other end as a remarkable public servant, a good man in a difficult situation." Through the years, many people have had so many opinions about RFK Jr., namesake of his iconic father. His character flaws and his environmental activism, and now his vaccine activism, have sparked controversy and scandal. But only history will tell what his legacy will be and define his standing in the Kennedy pantheon. This book, hopefully, has offered some clues. And that is the end of the book. I do want to add a couple of paragraphs here from the acknowledgments, because you might be interested to know about the sources that Jerry Oppenheimer tapped for the writing of this book. He writes, "The story of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is based on public and private documents, news accounts, his own writings, and most importantly, the many, many people whom I interviewed over a 2-year period. There were those who liked and respected him, those who didn't, and I wanted to know why in both cases. Most were honest, candid, and perceptive. Among them were boarding school classmates, college and law school chums, women in his life, political and environmental associates, supporters, and detractors. In other words, in order to write a fair and balanced portrait, it was important to probe every aspect of his life. As it turned out, of the many people I interviewed, Bobby was not one of them. While this book was always meant to be an independent biography, popularly called unauthorized, I also had planned to contact him with questions to get his side of the many issues that surfaced during my research. Prior to my reaching out to him, however, he presumably was well aware that I was writing a book about him. There had been mentions in the media of the work in progress, and some people I had called to interview told me that they first wanted to check with him before they committed to an interview. In early December 2014, I sent an email to Christine O'Neill, his assistant at Pace University Law School, and asked her to pass along to Bobby my request for an interview for the book I was completing. She responded by email, quote, "As soon as he reviews, I'll get back to you." When I got no response, I emailed her once again, asking whether she had passed on my request. Her response was yes, and that, quote, "Mr. Kennedy is currently traveling. As soon as he reviews, I will get back to you." Another email was sent in late December, but I heard nothing more from her or from him after that. That said, the author writes, "I'd like to offer my gratitude to all those who agreed to be interviewed and to talk candidly and openly and on the record. Their names and their words are documented throughout this book. There were those few who asked for anonymity, mainly to avoid losing friendships or access. You know who you are, and I thank you for your insights and perception." And that, my friends, is Jerry Oppenheimer's book, published 10 years ago by St. Martin's Press, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the Dark Side of the Dream. I want to thank you all for listening to this book club series, for participating, for your comments and questions. Please feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. And I do hope that you will subscribe to this channel. If you enjoy Kennedy content, we've got more on the way. I'm going to move on to another great book about the Kennedys called The Kennedys After Camelot, written by J. Randy Taraborelli, another great Kennedy historian who's written several books about the Kennedy family. But I really like After Camelot because it picks up the story after 1968, the era after Camelot, after the assassinations of JFK and RFK, and it takes you through right up to the present, the lives of all the various Kennedy siblings and children and grandchildren and, Teddy and Eunice, and it's just an amazing book. So if you'd like to hear the first couple of chapters, those are already available here on my channel. Just go to the playlists tab and look for The Kennedys After Camelot. And I will be updating that playlist very soon. So we will continue the Kennedy saga with that book. Once again, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this book. Please pass on the playlist, share it with a friend, and I'll see you next time. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.